Now, on the 20th century.
We were chained all the time, blindfolded.
Hostage.
It was a way to bring your cause, your plight to the world.
A spate of hostage dramas in the late 20th century sometimes promoted obscure causes.
The South Moluccan terrorists said they would release the rest of their hostages, but...
And sometimes turned big governments inside out in their rush to get them released.
There has never been a day that we have not been trying to get our hostages back from Lebanon.
I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century. Munich, 1972. Members of the Palestine Liberation Organization take 9 Israeli athletes hostage during the Olympics. All 9 athletes and most of their captors die in a failed rescue attempt. But the PLO considered the operation a resounding success because it reaped a windfall of publicity. Over 900 million people in 100 different countries who watched the Olympics now knew about the PLO.
This is a CBS News special report. Terror at the Olympics.
The Munich Olympics was the line in the sand that was crossed, and every terrorist group in the world could say, look at the attention that was generated based upon a hostage-taking situation like that.
Arab guerrillas had invaded the
It was the beginning of a new era in that terrorists really knew that if they do it right from their point of view, that they can get really a great deal of attention.
For Americans, the new era of hostage-taking for publicity began in Washington, D.C. on March 9, 1977, with an attack on the international headquarters of a large Jewish organization.
The bizarre series of events began shortly before noon at the B'nai B'rith headquarters when 4 gunmen arrived in a rental truck. Those gunmen moved inside and took somewhere between 50 and 100 people hostage on the top floor of the building.
Within an hour, the terrorists struck again. This time at Washington's Islamic Center on the edge of Rock Creek Park. 3 gunmen, carrying shotguns and knives, seized 11 additional hostages without firing a shot.
If the police try to come in here, we're going to start chopping off their heads, throwing them out the window. Because that's what our book tells us to do. That's what Allah tells us to do. That's what we're going to do.
Then at 2:20 p.m., another target was seized.
Then a third armed group struck the District of Columbia building, Washington City Hall. At least 2 people have been reported killed. One of them identified as 22-year-old Maurice Williams, a reporter for a local radio station.
Also wounded in the attack was a security guard and then city councilman, later Mayor Marion Barry.
And then a third shot I heard, and I hit my chest was hit. I knew I had been shot.
The gunmen were members of the Hanafi Muslims, a small sect of Sunni Muslims headquartered in Washington, who believed in strict adherence to the Quran. Led by 55-year-old Hamas Abdul Khalis, the Hanafis were bitter rivals of the larger and better-known black Muslims, whose membership included the late Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. Their rivalry had exploded into violence 4 years earlier in 1973, when some black Muslims had stormed a Hanafi house in northwest Washington that had been donated to them by basketball star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. 5 of Khalis's children were killed.
A baby 9 days old. Most people are afraid to hold a baby that young. But here you got somebody that took that baby in their arms and drowned it.
5 black Muslims had been convicted and imprisoned for the murders. But for Khalis, this apparently was not enough. By taking hostages at 3 key locations in Washington, Khalis hoped to force the federal government to turn the imprisoned black Muslims over to him.
We told this government to get busy and get the murderers that came into our house on January 18th and murdered our babies and our children and shot up our women.
I think that what made Khalis the dangerous person that he was at the time was that he had 4 years of burning within the pit of his stomach. Anyone that's able to maintain that level of anger and rage for that long a period of time is a very dangerous person.
Around the police perimeters, the press and the simply curious have continued to gather to watch the grim standoff. The gunmen have threatened to behead their prisoners if police try to overrun them.
The country suddenly knew, and the highest officials in the country knew, that here was a group that thought that they had been the victim of injustice, and a group that had not been able to talk to officials, and now they had access really to very high officials.
Beyond demanding that the men convicted of the murders be released to him, Khalis also wanted to stop the showing of a new movie called Muhammad, Messenger of God, which the Hanafis considered blasphemous. That was a demand police were prepared to meet.
It was only half over when the screen went dark. It was later revealed that police in Washington, D.C. had called the theater and asked that the movie be stopped so the hostages would not be harmed.
Some things the government can deal with, some demands, but are you going to release people from prison? Are you going to bring people that he suspects were part of this to the scene so he can take some action against them? No.
The attacks, only blocks from the White House, caused some chaos in the nation's capital.
Parts of Washington resemble a battlefield scene. Heavily armed police in flak jackets surround the three buildings. Sharpshooters lie in wait. Helicopters hover overhead. Barricades everywhere.
The bizarre standoff made it clear that the FBI was ill-equipped to deal with such a serious hostage situation.
The question was asked at the time of the B'nai B'rith situation, FBI, do you have a specialized team that could go in and rescue the hostages? Our answer, like the Metropolitan Police Department, was, well, we had a SWAT team. But SWAT teams are basically used in dangerous arrest situations where you need superiority of manpower or firepower. But as far as the very structured, specialized shooting skills, diversionary skills, surveillance skills that a hostage rescue team has, that did not exist in the U.S. government.
Fortunately, Khalis soon freed a number of the hostages, including those who had been injured at the B'nai B'rith building and at City Hall.
I think by him sending hostages out, he sent a message to everyone out there, too, that this can be resolved nonviolently if you work with me.
But the first day ended without any visible progress, and the siege entered a second day with 134 people still held hostage.
It is quiet this morning outside the B'nai B'rith headquarters here in Washington.
Gunmen who have been holding hostages in the mosque. It has been fairly static here.
There's been an ominous silence here since yesterday afternoon. There are two gunmen inside, holed up with 7 bound hostages on the top floor of the building there. But they won't talk to the police.
But by evening, Khalis agreed to speak to the ambassadors from 3 Muslim countries, Iran, Egypt, and Pakistan, who had volunteered their services to the State Department.
He wanted to negotiate with individuals who were much more knowledgeable of the Quran, who understood the religious and the political implications.
At 8 o'clock that night, the 3 ambassadors met with Khalis and his son-in-law in the lobby of the B'nai B'rith building.
The 3 read poetry to the Hanafi gunmen, read portions of the Quran, and somehow convinced them to end the siege.
I think Mr. Khalis decided and thought that it is best for everyone to be like this. He was concerned for the health of the hostages.
Just before 2 a.m., after a harrowing 39-hour siege, Khalis ordered all of the 134 hostages released.
Shaky. Glad to be out.
The hostages came pouring out, most from the B'nai B'rith building, 9 from the Islamic Center, 7 from Washington City Hall, the district building. Some were slightly hurt, all of them were tired, all of them were happy. Church bells rang in the city and the hostages smiled and waved.
After surrendering to the police, the 12 gunmen were charged with armed kidnapping. For his part, Khalis was released on his own recognizance, a condition he demanded before he'd surrender.
Abdul Khalis ended up behind bars today and surrounded by guards. But they're his own bars and his own Hanafi guards. Khalis was sent home by the court, released without bail on his own promise to return to court for trial.
To put Khalis on the street in Washington, D.C., even though he led a group that committed these horrible crimes, look at how many lives we saved. Look at how many people were perhaps spared further injury or death. I think it was a good bargain.
Khalis and his followers went on trial 4 months later in the same courtroom where the black Muslims had been tried for the brutal murders of Khalis' family. All 12 Hanafi Muslims were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms.
A lot of people, even though they held the Hanafi Muslims responsible for the acts that they committed, there was some element of sympathy when they heard the loss that Khalis had suffered within his family. So, is it worth the proverbial 15 minutes of attention to spend the rest of your life in jail? To some people, yes.
The successful negotiations that led to the end of the Hanafi Muslim crisis served as the catalyst for creation of the FBI's first hostage rescue team, because by the end of the 1970s, hostage situations seemed to be multiplying not just in the United States, but around the world, even in the peaceful Netherlands. That story when the 20th century resumes. The tiny island of South Molucca off the coast of Australia was formerly a Dutch colony. But in 1949, after a failed attempt by the South Moluccans to declare independence, it became part of Indonesia. Many South Moluccans fled to the Netherlands, where they lived in poverty. Over the years, their hopes of returning to their homeland had been dashed partly, the South Moluccans believed, because the Dutch had failed to help. So in 1977, just 2 days before the Dutch national elections, South Moluccan terrorists attacked 2 targets near the northern Netherlands town of Assen.
Witnesses said the hijackers boarded the train just before commandeering it with submachine guns, firing bullets into the roof and ordering passengers to their knees. Although the terrorists freed 42 passengers, it's believed some 50 others are still held hostage.
At the same time, 5 armed South Moluccans burst into an elementary school in nearby Bovensmilde, taking 105 children and 6 teachers hostage.
You may not get all the interest in the world just by taking over a train. Now they have a school, they have children, they have that special interest. It's going to tug at the heart, not simply of those citizens of Holland, but all over the world. We all identify when children are in jeopardy.
14 hours into the siege, the terrorists on the train allowed police to bring them a field telephone so they could make their demands.
They want a jumbo jet to take them and 21 other South Moluccans now in Dutch prisons to an unknown destination. If the demand is not met, they say, then people will be killed.
On the 3rd day of the crisis, the terrorists forced several children to appear at the windows of the school shouting, "We want to live."
Many terrorist groups, when they've taken hostages, will use psychological warfare. They want you to see, number 1, this is what we have, this has value, and number 2, this is what you're going to lose, perhaps, if you don't give in to our demands. And thirdly, it makes very good media coverage.
Then on May 27th, 5 days after the siege began, the Moluccans suddenly released the children and 2 of the teachers. 4 more teachers still remained hostage.
A father, his daughter cradled preciously, stealing away from the 5-day ordeal, hurrying home from the school. It was over suddenly, dramatically, much of it happening before dawn, after many of the more than 100 young hostages came down with a mysterious infection.
In a daring move, the Dutch government had delivered food to the school, laced with a non-toxic substance that nonetheless made the children sick.
The government took a calculated risk, and the risk was we will create enough trauma, enough activity for the part of the terrorist that they will have to release some of these children because they simply can't take care of them. And down deep in their hearts, they don't want to be responsible for the death of 100 children, so they'll let them out.
With the school children and several of their teachers safe, concern mounted for the hostages on the train.
The train has been stranded in sweltering heat for nearly a week. More than 60 people, hostages and hijackers, trapped in squalid living conditions, doctors fearing an outbreak of disease.
With conditions worsening, the government selected 2 Moluccans to help negotiate with the terrorists. But by June the 10th, the negotiations had stalled and the government decided it could wait no longer. On the 20th day of the crisis, June 11th, a special operations unit of the Royal Dutch Marines launched simultaneous attacks on the 2 targets, the schoolhouse was the first to fall.
Within minutes, Marines began appearing with the terrorists, one at a time. All of them pushed to the ground, roughed up, then bound and stripped of their clothing in search of weapons.
The 4 teachers were rescued unharmed. Meanwhile, 12 miles away, an attack on the train began with a diversion.
Dutch Air Force starfighters pouring down on the hijacked train. The afterburners, the noise shattering the pre-dawn calm.
Fighter planes coming in right over the top of the horizon, dropping right down, coming right over the top of the train, pointing their nose up, and then slamming the stick forward, going into afterburner and going straight up again. The tremendous noise, concussion, what it does is just, it totally disconcerts you.
I was under the blanket with my pillow over my head, and the train was going, so it was a hell.
Everyone was just thrown into a sense of pandemonium. The Dutch Marines used that to their advantage. They blew the door off the train, went into the train, engaged the terrorists in a firefight.
The firefight for the lives of the 51 hostages raged for more than 10 minutes.
When the smoke cleared, 6 Moluccans and 2 hostages lay dead.
The shooting and the siege suddenly over, medics came rushing in, Marines already removing the dead and wounded on stretchers. The freed hostages, strong enough to walk, were led away from the riddled train.
We are very glad to be sitting here before you, healthy and, most of all, free.
For the South Moluccans, it was yet another bitter chapter in their history.
The caskets were topped by blue, green, red, and white South Moluccan flags. Like the dawn raid that took their lives, the service by the hijackers was brief. When it was over, the South Moluccans returned to their houses along the Dutch canals, no closer to recapturing their Spice Islands homeland 8,000 miles away.
But they did succeed in accomplishing at least one of their goals.
The Moluccans set out to use terrorism to get the international community to listen to their grievances. And to that extent, they were successful.
That kind of success did not go unnoticed by a Beirut group calling itself the Islamic Jihad. But Islamic Jihad's targets were not Dutch, they were American. The ordeal of Terry Anderson when the 20th century continues. Beirut, Lebanon became the hostage capital of the world in the 1980s. Beginning in 1982, more than 70 Westerners, including 17 Americans, would be snatched off the streets by various factions who mostly shared a virulent hatred of the West, especially the United States. On March 16, 1985, members of a pro-Iranian group called the Islamic Jihad captured American journalist Terry Anderson on his way home from an early morning tennis match with a friend.
They pushed Terry into the back of this green Mercedes with a curtain around the back of it. It was a green Mercedes 280, and sped off.
I was on their list as a spy. Any Westerner, any American is certainly working for the CIA, right? And particularly one who's been spending several years going around the country asking questions.
In fact, the 37-year-old Anderson was chief Middle East correspondent for the Associated Press in Beirut. At the time, Anderson was engaged to marry a Lebanese researcher at NBC News in Beirut, name of Madeleine Basile, who was 6 months pregnant with their child. 2 months would go by before the Islamic Jihad released the first photograph of Anderson in captivity.
Last night, several Beirut newspapers carried photos of 4 Americans and 2 French diplomats who were believed held hostage by the pro-Iranian Lebanese Shiite terrorist group Islamic Jihad.
At the same time, they demanded the release of 17 Islamic Jihad members who were in prison for bombing the American and French embassies in Kuwait.
The prisoners were not released. The Kuwaiti government took a very hard line. But these hostage holders realized that they had a tremendous weapon in their hand in the persons of these hostages.
By taking hostages, the pro-Iranian Shiite groups hoped to stop the United States from supporting their Christian rivals in the bloody Lebanese civil war.
They saw the American presence as an attempt to impose a pro-Western order on Lebanon.
At various times, Anderson was imprisoned with 9 other Western hostages, including 4 Americans, Father Martin Jenko, Pastor Benjamin Weir, David Jacobson, and Thomas Sutherland. Blindfolded and shackled, they were moved around to different locations where conditions ranged from bad to worse.
You're just a piece of meat, chained to the wall. Nothing you can do, nothing you can say that will change the slightest thing in the world. You can't even decide when you're going to go to the bathroom.
A 7th American today was kidnapped by gunmen in Beirut.
These hostages became a great story in the mid-1980s, and the people who had them played them for all they were worth.
And to the Islamic Jihad, Terry Anderson was worth a lot.
They used me as their poster boy. They used to put my picture on their public statements, whether it had anything to do with me or not, just to prove who they were. We're the group that has the hostages. See, here's Anderson's picture. And then they would announce something about U.S. policy in the Middle East or something.
From the beginning, Anderson's sister, Peggy Say, pressed the U.S. government to do something.
And to all of those who have worked so hard to make sure that Terry Anderson is not forgotten.
She makes hundreds of speeches around the country pleading for help.
Peg was in everybody's face all the time, trying to insist that, by God, they might have to make decisions that were not helpful to getting me out, but they would do it knowing who I was.
I can't live knowing that my brother tonight is in a cellar somewhere in Beirut, and too few people care. So I'm going to ask you to listen to what I have to say, not with your heads, with your hearts.
Mr. President, the spokesman for the hostages...
The ordeal soon began to take its toll on President Ronald Reagan.
President Reagan personally got very emotionally involved. We know that for a stretch of time, it was every day that he would ask anything new about the hostages.
There has never been a day that we have not been trying every channel to get our hostages back from Lebanon.
He basically was unable to separate the human side and the perhaps national interest side of this issue.
He was aware of an attempt by Colonel Oliver North to try to get Iran's help in securing the hostages' release. What Iran wanted were U.S. arms to help in its war with Iraq, which the U.S. had been supplying with weapons. So while President Reagan was insisting that he would not negotiate with terrorists, the United States was, in fact, delivering a plane load of anti-tank missiles. And as a result, a hostage was freed.
I'm pleased to inform you, if you haven't heard, that Reverend Benjamin Weir, who was held hostage for 18 months in Lebanon, has now been released.
Weir brought reassuring news about the other American hostages.
I have from time to time met 4 of the other hostages, and in recent months been allowed to talk with them, even to worship with them on occasion, and they are all well.
Weir also met with Terry Waite, a special representative of England's Archbishop of Canterbury, who offered to act as an intermediary with the kidnappers.
Terry Waite, who had negotiated the release of some people in Libya and in Iran previously, agreed to take on the task and came to Beirut at least twice, and it was very dangerous.
It was a classic Beirut scene. Waite trying to be calm as Druze and Amal militiamen fought an intense street battle outside. Waite said he had made some progress in his quest to free the 4 Americans.
During the past week, I've had 2 further meetings with the captors of the 4 Americans. A good measure of mutual trust has been established.
But that trust turned shaky when the Islamic Jihad announced the execution of the CIA station chief in Beirut, William Buckley. He had been held hostage with Anderson.
They knew he was deathly ill, and they did nothing about it. And he died one night. And they took him out. And then they announced that they had killed him. What are they going to do? A dead hostage is only good for propaganda.
Revolutionary cells announced the death of another American hostage in April of 1986. This time, it was 62-year-old librarian Peter Kilburn, who was murdered in retribution for a U.S. airstrike on Libya. The death seemed to make the Reagan administration more determined than ever to trade more arms for the hostages. And so came another weapons sale to Iran, and on July 26, 1986, Father Martin Jenko was released.
I do know that Father Marty, while grateful to be free, was personally appalled when he learned that he had been freed for weapons of destruction that were going to kill other people.
My name is Terry Anderson.
In October, the Islamic Jihad asked Anderson to make a videotape, apparently to put pressure on the administration to make yet another arms delivery.
I didn't know what to do when they came to me and said, "We want you to make a video, read this." And I read it, and it was the usual badly written, illogical accusations and demands. And, I spent 6 years in the Marine Corps. You do not help the enemy, which was my initial reaction.
How long must we stay in captivity?
In the end, what decided me was, this is a way to tell my family I'm alive.
Not long after Anderson made the tape, hostage David Jacobson was released on November 2nd, 1986, flown out of Beirut, accompanied by Terry Waite.
And thank God for men like Terry Waite.
But in fact, Terry Waite had nothing to do with Jacobson's release.
They were swapping hostages for arms. And Terry Waite thought he was negotiating them out. He says he didn't understand that there was another game being played that he didn't know about.
The same week that Jacobson was released, news leaked out about the arms for hostages deal that came to be known as Iran-Contra, a bizarre scheme in which money from the weapons sales was being funneled to anti-government rebels in Nicaragua, the Contras.
Do you still maintain you didn't make a mistake, Mr. President?
And those revelations rocked Ronald Reagan's presidency.
The emperor was naked. We had been lecturing the world on being tough on terrorism, and we were caught doing business with the most terror-minded regime in the region, the Iranian regime.
The Iran part of the Iran-Contra scandal hurt President Reagan and certainly his picture in history, I think, a great deal.
Iran-Contra also hurt the credibility of Terry Waite.
He was told the last time he met with him, "Don't come back."
Absolutely nothing to do with it.
But he felt when Iran-Contra was revealed that he had to go back, that his reputation, his name had been stained, and he had to go back and try one more time. And that was a bad mistake, but he paid for it because they kidnapped him, and he spent the next 4 years in solitary confinement.
After the Iran-Contra scandal broke, no more American hostages were released for another 4 long years.
This has gone on too long.
And the only news of Terry Anderson came in the form of videotapes and photographs made by his captors. At the same time, Anderson's fiancée, Madeleine Basile, made videotapes of their daughter Suleme, born soon after his kidnapping. Basile sent birthday videos for Anderson to the Lebanese media in hopes that his captors would permit him to watch.
In June 1987, Suleme turned 2.
And in some cases, they did.
I love it, Daddy. Come to us.
I watched my daughter grow up on videotape.
Happy birthday, Daddy. Happy birthday to you.
Suleme, the daughter he has never known, is almost 5 now.
Please come home. Send me to the circus.
It was enormously painful, but I wouldn't have missed it for the world. I would not have not seen the tapes for anything.
But then, in July of 1989, a group calling itself the Organization of the Oppressed on Earth released a videotape showing the purported execution of kidnapped UN peacekeeper Marine Colonel William Higgins. That videotape helped convince the incoming Bush administration to change its strategy for dealing with the hostage situation.
The U.S. government wanted not to mention, not to talk about, not to have anything to do with hostages. It was a period of what they called trying to devalue the hostages, which sounds pretty harsh.
Suddenly, the hostage holders found themselves in a buyer's market, if you will, that they were holding what were a vanishing asset, that we had walked away, we had disengaged from the hostage story.
With his policy of devaluing the hostages, Bush in fact paved the way for their eventual release. But it took the UN to broker the final deal. Gian Domenico Pico, the Assistant UN Secretary General, risked his life to negotiate with the hostage takers.
He went out on the streets of Beirut and allowed himself to be kidnapped repeatedly by these men, blindfolded, put in a car just like the rest of us, driven to some place he didn't know, so he could talk to them, knowing that the previous negotiator, Terry Waite, was chained up next to me and had been for years.
Through Pico's efforts, Waite and Thomas Sutherland were released on November 18, 1991, and Terry Anderson was soon to follow.
The day before my release, one of the sub-chiefs, who spoke pretty good English, actually, chatted with me for a long time, just sitting, talking. They were giving me new clothes and shoes. He said, this was not a useful tactic. It did not work, and we're not going to do it anymore. We're not going to give up our fight against America, but we're not going to do this anymore.
On December 4th, 1991, the world saw Terry Anderson for the first time in 2,454 days. He'd been held captive for almost 7 years, the longest of any Western hostage seized in Beirut.
You can't imagine how glad I am to see you. I've thought about this moment for a long time. And now it's here. And I'm scared to death.
I look at those early tapes, you know what I see? I see my eyes. About this big around. They look like I'm on speed or something. I am. I'm on emotional speed, emotional overload.
I think you know how I feel. Excuse me.
Anderson came home to a hero's welcome. Reunited with his family, he met a 6-year-old daughter for the first time. And he finally married her mother, Madeleine Basile, in 1993. It took some time for Anderson to put the experience in perspective.
The job has been not to forget it, not to put it out of our lives, but to bring it into proportion, to bring it into balance. It's part of our lives. It happened. It's never going to go away. It's always going to be there. But it's not our whole life.
When hostage-taking finally ended in Lebanon after Anderson's release in 1991, many thought the era of political hostage-taking was over. But they were wrong. That story when the 20th century returns. The Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, also known as the MRTA, was a Peruvian terrorist group that was also pro-Castro, and it became one of Peru's most notorious terrorist groups in the 1980s. Then, in the early 90s, Peru's new president, Alberto Fujimori, cracked down on terrorism, and he jailed the leader of MRTA, along with hundreds of his followers. Then, on the night of December 17, 1996, the Tupac Amaru made a bold attempt to put themselves back on the political map in Peru. They staged an attack in Lima on an elegant party given by Japan's ambassador to Peru.
The first noise was a very loud explosion. A lot of people presumed that it was a car bomb.
The attack began after 8 p.m. when witnesses say a rocket was fired into the compound.
Within minutes, the guests were facing gunmen wearing the red and white masks of the MRTA.
Suddenly, I saw a guy running behind me with a rifle in his hand, a handkerchief on his head, and a sign of MRIT on his arm.
After winning a firefight with police, who had quickly rushed to the scene, the terrorists rounded up the 500 guests, including high-ranking government officials, as well as some relatives of President Alberto Fujimori. In a matter of hours, though, the 14 rebels released some of the hostages.
Early on, the terrorists released the women and children and a few elderly men. Among those released was Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori's mother.
If you're a terrorist, one of the things you have to think of is how do we get this down to a manageable group so that it still meets our political need for theater with the right players, but it doesn't become a logistical problem or a physical threat to us.
The next day, on December 18th, the leader of the MRTA attack, 43-year-old Nestor Serpa Cartolini, issued his demands.
They are demanding the release of 400 of their jailed comrades. If it doesn't happen, they have said they will kill their hostages.
The hostages learned early on that the terrorists could be very violent.
They put the rifles on our head anytime, and the two lady terrorists, they came to our room and they put explosives inside.
5 days after the attack, President Fujimori responded to the terrorist demands.
He promised a peaceful approach from the state, but not until the rebels put their guns down and released their captives.
He was kind of the velvet-covered brick. He indicated a willingness to negotiate, to talk.
But in fact, only hours after the takeover, Fujimori had met with key military advisors to begin planning a secret rescue mission.
I think President Fujimori wanted a nonviolent solution, but he was fully aware of the need of the option of a tactical rescue.
Then, in what the rebels called a Christmas goodwill gesture, several hundred more hostages were released on December 22nd. One hostage, Father Juan Julio Wicht, refused to leave.
I said, who will be with them inside of the residence? They will have nobody.
And he walked up to the person who was reading off the list from the MRTA and he said, I'm not going. I'm going to stay here. And without waiting for an answer, turned around and walked away. I mean, the effect was electric.
On December 31st, 2 weeks after the crisis began, reporters were unexpectedly invited inside for an impromptu news conference.
If all along the rebels' main goal has been attention, they must be pleased tonight. The world's cameras have been in to see them.
The news conference also provided the government a chance to gather intelligence.
I will guarantee you there were Army officials and police officers who were in there posing perhaps as cameramen. They were looking to identify points of entry into that building, fortifications, weapons, routine on the part of the terrorists.
In late December, negotiations with the rebels also began, continuing throughout January. But little progress was made for the release of the 72 hostages.
Direct talks between the government and the rebels appear to be broken down. The head of the Red Cross has been looking dejected lately, leaving the compound empty-handed. The hostages have radios. They know progress is stalled.
Even as the talks resumed in February, President Fujimori was planning a bold endgame of his own. It involved the clandestine digging of 5 tunnels under the residence to allow commandos to storm the compound. The noise of the digging was masked by loud music and by other distractions staged by the troops outside the compound. Other preparations were underway as well.
The Army was able to build a mock-up of the Japanese ambassador's residence where the military could practice every step you're going to take. It's critical to know if I take 3 steps down this hall and make a right-hand turn, there's going to be a door, and that's a door I have to go in. And in this case, some retired FBI agents helped in the tactical planning of this also, bringing that level of expertise to the Peruvian government.
Also helpful was a secret 2-way radio that had been smuggled into the residence, allowing the government to communicate daily with the hostages.
A few of them had some ways to communicate with outside. Very few. 2 or 3, perhaps 4. They didn't tell us, and I am glad they didn't.
In early March, 2.5 months into the crisis, President Fujimori returned from a surprise visit to Cuba with an offer of asylum there for the rebels from Fidel Castro. But rebel leader Serpa rejected the deal, sticking instead to his original demands. Then he broke off the talks completely when he became suspicious of noises coming from beneath the residence.
By March also, we all knew, the terrorists knew, that tunnels were being built below the house. You could hear the noises.
Although the government denied that any tunnels were under construction, Serpa moved the hostages to another part of the residence.
He decided to move all the people from the first floor to the second floor. And he opens the possibility for the military people to come through the first floor.
Even as the terrorists recognized the threat posed by the tunnels, they gradually became complacent. They used a room on the first floor for a regular 3 p.m. soccer game.
They developed a routine in their life. They fully anticipated the authorities would not come in.
But when Serpa cut off the daily medical visits to the hostages on April 19th, that was all Fujimori needed to begin the countdown for the rescue.
The military people were very, very smart to put more than 100 people inside the tunnels without the newspapermen notice this.
On April 22nd, the hostages alerted the government via their secret radio that the 3 p.m. soccer game had begun.
Out of nowhere, we saw explosions at the residence at 3:25 in the afternoon. No one expected this to happen in broad daylight.
9 pounds of explosives blasted holes in the first floor where the soccer game was in progress, killing 4 of the rebels instantly. As the hostages threw themselves on the floor, another series of explosions went off in the tunnels underneath the residence.
When the operation started, I said, this is it. The end of the world.
The strike force of 150 commandos streamed into the compound.
They came through the front, the back, and after more explosions, they appeared on the roof, hustling hostages to freedom.
We went one by one, following the steps of the officer.
In the gunfire, one hostage, a Supreme Court justice, died from a heart attack. All 14 MRTA rebels were killed.
The hostage rescue force that goes in, they really do not have time to put them up against a wall, search them, handcuff them, because by the time you do that, 20 hostages are dead in the next room because you took your time. I think that in a hostage rescue mission, you let the professionals do what they do best, which is to save the lives of the innocents.
2 of the commandos also died in the rescue operation.
I asked one of the officers, do you have any victims? Yes, Father, 2. And I said, I'm sorry. He said, we are trained, Father. We are trained for that.
Just 23 minutes after the rescue began, the commandos emerged on the roof giving the victory sign. And the hostages were led down a ladder to the garden, freed after 126 days in captivity. They were escorted out of the compound by a jubilant President Fujimori.
This was something very national for them. It meant a lot to the Peruvian government to be able to handle this themselves. Did they have advice? Of course they did. Did they have help and training? Sure they did. Was it 2 members of the Peruvian military that died in this assault? Yes, they did. They did a good job, and they did it themselves with a little help from their friends.
The next day, Fujimori returned to the residence.
Triumphantly, Fujimori took some of the victorious commandos and his own TV crew on a tour of the Japanese ambassador's residence. He stood over the body of 2 rebels. Rebel leader, Nestor Serpa, his arch enemy during the crisis, is on the right.
The daring rescue in Lima underscored the increasing resolve of governments not to give in to the demands of hostage takers. But that did not mean an end to hostage taking.
Hostage takings have been with us since the beginning of biblical recorded times. They'll be with us again till we finally find a way to wipe everybody off the face of the earth. And anytime someone who feels underrepresented for their cause is looking for a way to get attention and they can't get it any other way, they are going to dial 911 hostage and step onto that theater, and we're all going to observe one more time.
But at the end of the 20th century, experts suggested that hostage-taking may be evolving into deadly new forms. More about that when the 20th century returns. All the world's a stage, and a very good one for terrorists who've taken hostages in order to gain publicity for their cause. On the eve of the 21st century, experts predicted new hostage dramas could involve scores of people threatened with chemical or biological attack. Entire communities, the experts said, could be held hostage by such weapons. And what is worse, even highly trained hostage rescue teams and experienced hostage negotiators appeared powerless in the face of such threats. So even while hostage-taking had diminished as a political statement, the destructive potential of any future hostage dramas was growing. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th Century.